book. I'm here with Eli Rubin and Elliot Wolfson for our keynote address. This is the final panel of this week of the Social Vision Conference series. Before we begin, I want to briefly just plug Monday's events. So coming up this Monday, February 1st, we'll have a deliberation on Jewish education at 12 noon, followed up at 2 by a talk with Richard Sugarman, and then at 3 p.m. there will be a brief discussion with Joseph Telushkin. So come back for that. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Eli Rubin, who will be introducing Elliot Wolfson.
Hi, everyone. My name is Eli Rubin, and I'm an editor and research writer at Chabad.org, where I focus on Chabad thought and history. On the side, I'm finishing up a PhD dissertation at University College London, where the late Professor Ada Rapoport Albert was my primary advisor. And I also collaborated with Philip Wexler now about 2 years ago, coming on to 2 years that we finished the project, in writing Social Vision, the Lubavitcher Rebbe's Transformative Paradigm for the World, which was published by Herder and Herder in 2019, and is the inspiration for this week-long or more virtual conference. And I'm here today to introduce the keynote of this conference, which will be delivered by Professor Elliot R. Wolfson. Before I do that, before I introduce him, I want to thank the organizers and all the contributors who have shared their thoughts, their vision, and their critical insight over the last few days. And I want to thank all of you who are listening in. And I invite you to take note of your own thoughts and to submit any questions you might have for Professor Wolfson in the chat or in the Q&A section, which you can see on the bottom of your Zoom module if you're using Zoom. Hopefully, we'll have some time at the end for some follow-up questions and to elicit some further thoughts. Okay, so here's the introduction. Professor Elliot R. Wolfson holds the Marsha and J. Glazer Endowed Chair in Jewish Studies at UC Santa Barbara. He's a renowned scholar who has deeply enriched the study of Jewish mysticism, drawing on and contributing to the fields of philosophy, literary criticism, feminist theory, postmodern hermeneutics, Eastern mystical traditions, and the phenomenology of religion. He has also published many, many notable books, twice winning National Jewish Book Awards, and twice winning awards from the American Academy of Religion. Here I'll mention only 2 titles: Open Secret, Post-Messianic Messianism and the Mystical Revision of Menachem Mendel Schneerson, published by Columbia University Press in 2009, and his most recent release, Heidegger and Kabbalah, Hidden Gnosis and the Path of Poesis, published by Indiana University Press in 2019, or 2020, I don't know. Okay, there is more to be said about Professor Wolfson's many prestigious appointments and scholarly contributions, but instead I want to preface his keynote with a few personal reflections about the way his work has been a beacon of illumination for me in my study of Chabad thought in general, and in respect to my collaboration with Philip in Social Vision more specifically. Back in 1988, the year before I was born, a landmark conference was convened at University College London. Its proceedings were subsequently published under the title Hasidism Reappraised, edited by Ada Rapoport Albert. Professor Wolfson's contribution bears the title Walking as a Sacred Duty, Theological Transformation of Social Reality in Early Hasidism. And it strongly prefigures the kind of conceptual synergy that Philip Wexler was also beginning to approach at about the same time, albeit from the direction of classical sociology, a project which came to its culmination in Social Vision. In that article, Professor Wolfson articulated the notion that there are 2 models of cleaving to God. A vertical one, which entails the metaphor of ascent and descent, and B, a horizontal one, which entails the metaphor of traversing from place to place. Wexler articulates a very similar conception, which he based on the work of the phenomenological philosopher Anthony Steinbach. There is the vertical or mystical dimension and the horizontal or social dimension, which are in fact axiomatically conjoined. As Professor Wolfson put it in that article, in early Hasidism, the proper worship of God was said to be realized even as one physically walked about and was engaged in social commerce. In a footnote to that article, Professor Wolfson also forecasts the need for a scholarly project that would eventually be realized in his own book, Open Secret. Quote, the whole question of Messianism in Hasidism should be re-examined from a phenomenological as opposed to a historical point of view. Just a line or two later, he went on to note that the implicit messianic dimension of Bechtian Hasidism is connected especially with the social need to communicate esoteric truths. Okay, one more point before I give you the floor, Professor Wolfson. I first joined the Chabad.org editorial team nearly a decade ago, and my very first article was a reflection and an amplification of Professor Wolfson's reading of a teaching from the seventh Rebbe of Chabad Lubavitch, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, on the nature of innovation in Torah, which bears deeply on the question of the relationship between past, present, and future. Envisioning the future has been the theme of this week's conference, and so I invite Professor Wolfson to deliver his keynote address titled In the Footsteps of the Footsteps, Futural Remembering and Awaiting the Past.
Thank you very much, Eli, for that very warm introduction. And it's no exaggeration for me to say that when I see my work engaged in your work, it actually brings me tremendous pleasure, and much more than the run-of-the-mill academics who sometimes engage my work, although most of the time not so effectively. But before I start, I want to thank Philip, Menachem, and whoever else was responsible for inviting me to offer these words of reflection. So in my talk today, I will focus on the question of futurity. And the part of the social vision that is most relevant to my reflections will be the epilogue, the dynamic of disenchantment and reenchantment in the past and future, and particularly the first section, Schneerson's temporal dialogue with the eternal Torah. We all know that the word epilogue relates to the section at the end of a book that serves as a comment on or a conclusion to what has been presented in the rest of the book. The epilogue, in short, reveals the meaning of the work, and thus it is reasonable that it comes at the end. In the postface to Open Secret, I wrote that I began to write the postface as the preface, but soon realized that what I initially conceived of as the entry was in fact the exit. And to ascertain that wisdom, I further surmised, may have been the point of my journey. Reversing the common sense order, the first portal through which one enters is the way of departure, and the second, through which one departs, is the way of entry. The wise of heart know that the way in and the way out are indifferently the same. I will take the liberty of applying this insight to the epilogue of social vision. However, before engaging that epilogue, and particularly the question of the future, specularized through the prism of the nature of time, let me make some preliminary remarks that will set the conceptual framework for my observation on the relationship of the temporal and the eternal. It may have been some time for Menachem Mendel Schneerson to feel comfortable assuming the role of Rebbe of the Chabad Lubavitch movement, but there is little doubt that when he finally did accept it, marked by Hasidim as the deliverance of the Bati Lagani discourse on the 10th of Shvat, 5711, the first yahrzeit of the passing of his father-in-law, the Rebbe Rayatz, he did so out of the conviction that he would complete the mandate of his predecessor by leading the seventh generation, which he characterized in the traditional locution as living in the Ikvada de Mashiach, the footsteps of the Messiah, sometimes more emphatically as the footsteps of the Messiah, Ikvata de Mashiach, or as the end of the footsteps, Siyuma de Ikvata. To tackle the question of the future as it pertains to Schneerson's teachings, this is where we must start, by accepting that his conception of historical time was informed by the unwavering belief that we are in the footsteps of the footsteps. But what does it mean to be in the footsteps of the footsteps? the end of the footsteps? How long is the period of time marked by this locution? Does it have an expiration date, or is it interminable, the end that cannot end and still be the end? I do not want to revisit here my argument in open secret, but there are two critical points of my hypothesis that are worth noting as they are relevant to the ensuing analysis. First, while Schneerson obviously embraced the distinction between Gula Klalit and Gula Pratit, the general redemption and the individual redemption, the nature of the former is informed by the latter, such that the most salient feature of the messianic redemption is a transformation of spirit, an overcoming of the dichotomies that inform our current experience of the world. In the absence of the cultivation of this consciousness, there is no collective redemption of which to speak. Thus, as Schneerson emphasized, the chidush, the novelty of the coming of the Messiah, is in the bond of divinity with corporeality, such that the hierarchical relation of body and soul will be reversed, and the physical body will behold the godliness in all things, an idea linked exegetically to diverse, the presence of the Lord shall appear, and all flesh as one shall behold, for the Lord himself has spoken, Isaiah 45. The redemption, therefore, is marked by the fact that the concealment, ha'elem, which is the world, ha'olam, will no longer be concealed. But what is revealed when the concealment is no longer concealed? In his inaugural address, Schneerson addressed this question by asserting Elohus und Olam and Olam in the selbe Sach. Divinity and the world are one and the same thing. Answering one question, however, gives rise to another, and perhaps more difficult question. What is the import of the words selbe Sach? Does sameness eradicate or preserve difference? Can we say that the finite world loses its role of concealing the light of the infinite because we become cognizant of the fact that the world and the essence of infinity are identical? In Open Secret, I remarked that Schneerson's words imply that the disparity between divinity and nature is erased in a manner that is a reversal of Spinoza's notorious maxim Deus sive natura, God or nature. That is, the Rebbe is speaking about the divinization of nature rather than the materialization of God. The discernment that nature is divinity on the part of Schneerson is based, therefore, on preserving the identity of their non-identity. That is, Elohus und Olam in dieselbe Sach signifies the ultimate paradox, the paradox of paradox, what Schneerson refers to as nimna ha-nimnaot, the impossible of impossibilities. That is, the containment of the boundless light of the infinite, or Ein Sof habilti gvul, in the finite world of space and time. Taking hold of this paradox allows us to contrast the Chabad view with Spinoza's perspective, according to which divinity and nature are so completely identified that any sense of divergence between them is obliterated. The second point I want to emphasize is that in its deepest temporal cadence, the messianic moment is an event that cannot occur in the temporal flow of nature, but which nonetheless is the very condition that accounts for our experience of the continuity of time. In contrast to the philosophical doctrine of presentism, that is, the conviction that everything is present or that only that which is present exists, the phenomenological chronology that I embrace and which I contend can be applied to the Chabad-Lubavitch ruminations on time posits that what ensures presence is the absence of being present. From this vantage point, time is always to be measured in terms of not being. This relates to the chiastic paradox that I believe overwhelmed the Rebbe's thinking and being. The future is already present as the present that is always future. To cast this matter in sharp relief, we can contrast it with the paradox that has informed Christian messianic hope through the centuries. to believe that the one who is to come is the one who has already come. Hence, the awaiting for the parousia, or the second coming, renders the future present by its having been in the past. By contrast, the messianic hope in Judaism, which has fueled the Chabad worldview, is predicated on an awaiting that renders the present future by anticipating a return to a past that is always yet to be. Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back, renew our days as of old. In Lamentations 5:21. Chadesh Yameinu Kikedem. That is, read Kabbalistically, the renewal of that which is ancient is a renewal of that which has never been. And now, applying it even more technically, Keter, which is associated with Kedem, Keter, or the crown, right, the infinite will of Ein Sof, is coterminous with the infinite, and thus it is constantly renewed as that which has eternally been what is to become. Now, in deference to time, I will not read the next section, but briefly summarize it. This verse of Lamentations is interpreted or associated with the act of tshuva, the act of return, which, as we know, following Talmudic precedent, and also his predecessors in the Chabad Lubavitch dynasty, is upheld by the Rebbe as the means that will expedite the messianic coming, or as he puts it, the avodah hatshuva, the worship of repentance, which is linked to this pietistic ideal of misirat hanefesh, self-sacrifice, is the mode of worship that occupies a higher level than even avodah the Torah u'mitzvot, the worship of the law and the commandments. And why is that so? Because tshuva embodies the paradox of shnei hafachim b'nosei achad, two opposites in one subject. Okay, so let me return now to the main point. The paradoxical nature of temporality as the replication of the same that is always different is further illustrated by the fact that the attribution of the name Elliot to Keter implies that it is a name that names nothing that is, but only the potential to be what will be. Let me cite here one crucial passage from the Zohar. The primordial one is Eya. This is the supernal concealed one. As it is said, I am what I am. And this is rendered in Aramaic, Ana man da Ana. So Eya, Asher Eya becomes Ana man da Ana. I am what I am. But it is not, the Zohar continues, but it is not known what it is. Below ityada manhu. Subsequently, the verse says, Asher Eya, I am that which is summoned to be revealed. Ana dezamin li'itgalia. So Eya, or the infinite will, denotes an insubstantiality conveyed in the expression, I am what I am. And the nature of that I is not known apart from what will be unfurled in the disclosure of its concealedness. And in that sense, right, we can say of that I, that it is what it will be summoned to be revealed. And hence we see an intrinsic connection here between Zman, time, and the idea of summoning, Zamin, but specifically the summoning of a present that is determined contemporaneously by the past of a future that is yet to come, as what has already been, and by the future of the past that has already been what is yet to come. And it is my contention that Chabad messianism revolves about this axis. The aspect of Messiah and the corresponding level of the soul, Yechidah, are linked specifically to this gradation of the divine. And thus we can deduce we can deduce therefrom something rudimentary about the temporal comportment of the messianic future as the coming of the being that is already present as what is perpetually on the way to become. Now, Philip and Ellie in Social Vision generously refer to this idea of mind in conjunction with Schneerson's interpretation of the rabbinic presumption that innovations in the study of Torah were encompassed in God's eternal thought before they were innovated in time, because in God, past and future are one. After citing my claim that such a view calls into question aligning events chronoscopically in a sequence stretched from before and after, they write, equally importantly, however, it singles the awesome imperative in history, the imperative of history. So in the spirit of Machloket L'Shem Shemayim, I would say that this gloss is somewhat misleading, as it implies that my phenomenological method denies the imperative history, or that I have repudiated the notion that Hasidic ideas can contribute to shaping new sociological patterns. What I have offered is a different construal of the historical and the socio-mystical based on a variant hermeneutic of time. So what is important here is that a more accurate understanding of my position sheds light on Schneerson's conception of history in the social domain, which in turn relate to his messianic teaching. So this discussion is not about defending myself, but it does have repercussions for the claims that are elicited from or built on the foundation of his thinking with respect to the possibilities of a genuine social transformation in the future. Again, because of time, I'm going to skip the next section, which gets into more detail regarding this paradox of the new and old as it relates to Torah study. And this is something that is discussed in the epilogue of Social Vision. And some of the texts I discuss are engaged again in Social Vision, and some new texts which I did not discuss are brought to bear in this question. But again, the essential idea is that the new interpretations of Torah that come to light in the course of history pre-existed in the infinite thought or the wisdom of the divine, the supernal Torah that emanates from the essence of the infinite. Now, but here's the paradox that we have to take hold of. Their newness is not in diametric opposition to their antiquity or their having been. Their coming to be in time is a genuine sense of chidush, of novelty, but the sense of novelty here has to be measured against this paradoxical conception that what is new is old because what is old is new. And again, that has bearing, I believe, on the question of how we are to apply this teaching to social transformation. Okay, I'm skipping quite a bit here, but here's where I think the relevance of what I'm saying might come to light, or as they say, where the rubber hits the road. The past can be experienced as present because the present can be experienced as past. But the present can be experienced as past only because the past can be experienced as present. Concretely, this abstract theorizing of time intimates that any transmutation of new ideas, which of course is a crucial part of the Hasidic ethos as depicted in Social Vision, will have to comply with the paradox of repetition and innovation. A novel change in society can only succeed if it is recognized as old. If this paradox is not heeded, then as the authors of Social Vision already conjectured, and I quote, the transformative success of Hasidism as the basis for a new social paradigm might lead to its own failure, to a new form of secularization and disenchantment. So another way of putting this is that I see no conceptual basis in the Rebbe's teachings to mandate a revolution of a disjunctive nature. Even the idea of a Torah Chadash, the new Torah, to be heralded by the Messiah, even that idea of a law beyond the binaries of permissible and forbidden is imaginable because it is believed to have been mandated by the Torah itself. So the exceeding of the law is an integral part of the law. And here, I won't read this again because it's too long, but there is an extraordinary passage which I did translate and discuss in Open Secret, where the Rebbe elaborates on the decoding of the word Elul as an acrostic for Aron Luchot v'Shivrei Luchot, the Ark of the Tablets and the Broken Tablets, which is found in the Megaleh Amukot of Natan Neta Shapira of Krakow. So it's a long passage, I won't read it, but getting to summarizing my analysis, the acrostic for Schneerson conveys the notion that both the broken tablets and the tablets that are intact are enclosed in one container. And this allows him to develop the crucial idea that Torah and repentance, respectively the tablets and the broken tablets, are bound together. The breaking of the tablets are preserved together in the ark to teach us that extending beyond the law is itself an aspect of the law, indeed the very measure of the law. Because if you think about it, tshuva calls upon us to exceed what the law demands. Right? And this is epitomized in Talmudic teaching, which is often repeated by the Rebbe, that tshuva, repentance, has the power to turn guilt into innocence, to turn one thing into its opposite. By the strict measure of the law, this is an absurdity, this is an impossibility. But what I'm contending is the Rebbe understood that this quality of tshuva, the exceeding of the law, is the very measure of the law. So to be released from the law is not attained by discarding the law, but by executing the law with an intensity that pushes past its limit. The encroachment of boundary demarcates the threshold of the boundary to be encroached. So I'll just take a few more minutes here because I want to leave room for reactions and conversation. But if we turn now to the refocusing our attention on the question of the future and the messianic restitution that may be extrapolated from the Rebbe's teachings. It is common to think of redemption primarily in terms of the future. And this is the approach that fuels the utopian spirit of social vision, epitomized in the conviction that Schneerson desired, quote, the Hasidic ethos to become a new foundation for a sacralized global society, providing an entirely new paradigm for individual life and communal life, for social institutions, and for political norms. So I don't want to belabor the point, but there you see the language, an entirely new paradigm. So the idea that I was articulating before with respect to the paradox of the new and the old would at least raise questions about what does it mean to say an entirely new paradigm. Regarding the centrality of the future to what is presumed to be Schneerson's desire, quote, to re-enchant and re-sacralize the everyday experiences and practices and interactions of all people everywhere, let me quote one critical passage from the epilogue to Social Vision. It is our contention that while Schneerson was born, lived, and died in the 20th century, his ideas do not belong to the past, but to the future. In his own lifetime, his impact was already international, and in the subsequent quarter century, his influence has continued to proliferate. Yet the full universality of his vision remains to be realized in the redemptive step beyond the present. Okay, the redemptive step beyond the present. Now, this is a familiar locution to give expression to the messianic impulse. While I would acknowledge the reasonableness of presuming that the redemptive step is always of the future, we must nevertheless admit that Jewish history has proven that the future that is coming has consistently proved to be not the future that has been anticipated. Insofar as every figure in the course of Jewish history that has claimed a messianic status has been judged retroactively to be false. We can hypothesize, therefore, that the belief in a Messiah cannot materialize in time without being a denunciation of itself. It is within this space of deferment, the future cannot arrive and still be the future, that the spectacle of Jewish messianic hope must be envisioned. The tenor of that hope is well captured by Maurice Blanchot's ironic observation: waiting is always a wait for waiting, wherein the beginning is withheld, the end suspended, and the interval of another wait thus open. So the impossibility of waiting is what is essential to the possibility of waiting. Again, I'm going to skip here. Let me mention here Yeshayahu Leibovich's famous reinterpretation of the 12th of the 13th principles of faith proposed by Maimonides. I believe by complete faith in the coming of the Messiah. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema beviat HaMashiach. So the belief, Leibovich argued, is anchored in a Messiah who is coming, beviat Mashiach, and not in a Messiah who has come. Now, this is a clever reading of Messiah, of Maimonides, and one that, to be candid, better accommodates the historical experience of the Jewish people. It would seem, however, that this explanation clashes fundamentally with what the Rebbe ostensibly believed. But a deeper and bolder reading of the Rebbe's teaching leads us to the insight that time is structurally futural, but its futurity does not belong to the three modalities of time. And this too is something that I elaborate in quite a bit of technical detail, and I will skip that here, but only to say that what informed thinking of, really from the Alter Rebbe to the Rebbe, with respect to this notion, is that the present, the bridge between a present that is no longer and a present that is not yet, that present is in time but outside of time. What do I mean by that? There's a connection made between that present and the Tetragrammaton, understood as the confluence or the compressence of the three temporal modalities, Haya, Hoveh, V'Hiyeh. It was, it is, and it will be. But that confluence or that compressence is the quality of eternality that exceeds time, but nevertheless is manifest in time. Zman she'eno zman. So that's what I would suggest is the model for this, the messianic hope. It's not an expectation of a future that never was, but it is fully lived in the present, in the compressence of the three modalities that, in that sense, mimics or emulates the eternality of the Shem HaMeforash, right, the Tetragrammaton. Okay, so from the standpoint of the infinite, all time, and here I'm referring to a passage from the Tzemach Tzedek, the Rebbe's namesake, all time is comprised in the Rega Katan, the little while, right, or the infinitesimal moment, the smallest of demarcations, which is also connected to the quality of Malchut, right, which is the potential for boundary within the boundless. And it's not coincidental that the Rebbe spoke of the coming of the Messiah precisely in terms of this Rega Katan, the interlude of time that cannot be measured in time, in and through which he writes, or he spoke, we will exit from slavery to freedom and to the great light in the true and complete redemption through our righteous Messiah. The insinuated tenselessness of the intersection of the three temporal modes in this moment renders it meaningless, I think, to speak of the now in terms of the passage of time. So this, I think, should give pause for understanding that famous chant. We want Mashiach now. We don't want to have to wait. Yes, we want Mashiach now. And the Rebbe demonstrated that this chant was something he approved of and brought him some sort of pleasure. But what would it mean in terms of his teaching? What is the now exactly? He understood in light of what I've tried to present here. So let me come to my conclusion. Any way to the future must be through the present, since philosophically speaking, the only mode of time that is real is the present. But as I've discussed, there is something peculiar about this present. To be the moment must pass as the moment on the way to becoming the moment it is to be. But in passing to become that moment, the moment morphs into the past and thus ceases to be on the way to becoming the moment it is to be. It follows that what transpires momentarily cannot truly be of the moment. For what comes to pass previously received its name, and what will come to be subsequently is what it currently has already become. The now, in other words, perpetually presents itself as the now that is presently not now, the instant of immediacy that can never be grasped as the object of immediate experience, but the condition that makes all experience possible. This, I submit, is the insight that drove the Rebbe's messianic teaching. And I am not sure, and please forgive my heresy, if he fully squared the circle, so to speak. That is, if he understood fully how all the components of his speculation on the nature of temporality crystallized into a coherent whole. One thing, however, that seems certain in this aporetic uncertainty, if the messianic vision of Schneerson is to be salvaged as a transformative paradigm for the world, it can do so only if such a program remains faithful to his understanding of the future that is now, because now is the future. Which is to say, the eruption of tomorrow will not be a disruption of today. Or, as I've put it elsewhere, the overcoming will be an undergoing. The tablets that are broken must be preserved in the Ark of the Covenant. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wolfson. It's always wonderful to learn from you. And this was an especially worthy and illuminating engagement. There's so many points that I could pick up on. The importance of your notion of the hypernomian, that the going beyond is not a breaking of the law, but is continuous with the law or mandated by the law. And especially, I think in your conclusion, what I hear is a critical call for us to realize that the Rebbe's vision cannot be understood in merely aspirational and futuristic terms, because the future can only be grasped through transformation, perpetual renewal in the present. And this is a point that you've made many times, and for me, it always kind of resonates in the terms of that the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneor Zalman, the idea articulated in chapter 37 of the Tanya, and here I quote, "This ultimate perfection of the Messianic era and the resurrection of the dead, meaning the revelation of the Ein Sof light in this physical world, is dependent on our actions and service throughout the time of the duration of the exile. For in enacting the mitzvah, man elicits the revelation of blessed Ein Sof light from above downward. So there you have, in very clear terms, right at the outset, in that foundational discussion of the telos, the ultimate purpose of human action, of creation, of existence, in the Tanya, you have already there this notion of the meshech, the duration, and that is this duration of exile that instantiates the Messianic era. At several points, you entered into some more particular criticism and also responded to what might be perceived as criticism within the pages of social vision of your own work, especially in Open Secret. And here, part of me always wants to just kind of mix out and say, to quote the rabbinic kind of phrase, who am I that I should put my head between these two great mountains? But since my name does appear beneath Phillips on the cover of Social Vision, I do feel obliged to at least say something. And what I'll say is that I want to refer to a distinction that you recently drew in your article, Suffering Time, Maharal's Influence on Hasidic Perspectives on Temporality, footnote 66. So there you distinguish between the coincidence of opposites and the juxtaposition of opposites. So I just want to think about Social Vision and Open Secret for a minute in these kind of terms. I do not believe that Social Vision and Open Secret should be understood to stand in an oppositional relationship to one another necessarily, whether in their general orientation or in the specific theorizations of the Rebbe's teachings. To borrow from your own presentation today, each of these interpretive gestures, and they are certainly far more than gestures, is a reenactment, or one might say a re-scrutinization of the Rebbe's revelatory teachings, each from its own inimitable vantage point. And these two perspectives certainly cannot be thought of as merely coinciding, but nor do I wish to see them as juxtapositionally colliding. For me, they are complementary to one another, such that in sustaining difference rather than surmounting difference, a richer perspective on the whole is adduced. At this point, I just want to say that there are I see already one question in the Q&A, so if anyone else wants to put questions in the Q&A, please do so, and I'll read them out. But I'm going to start with a question of my own, which arises from my own recent work, especially on Rashab's, the fifth Rebbe Samach Vav, which, as I see it, the more that I return to Samach Vav, I see that there's a key term is Or Chadash Mamish, completely new illumination, a completely new luminosity. And so what I'm wondering is, in relation to the paradigm that you've articulated, really going back to Aleph Mem Tau, and in so many of your work on time and on the tradition of innovation, Torah innovation, coming up with new Torah in the rabbinic and Kabbalistic traditions. So and as you've articulated again today, you have this model of linear circularity. And it's usually understood that the origin of the innovation lies in the past, and it's disclosed anew through its inimitable repetition in the present. Now, what I've recently been thinking, and I want to hear what you think about this, is that in the case of the Rebbe, in that particular text that you discussed today, where he talks about the Talmud Vasik, the seasoned student, who everything that he innovates, every new concept was already given. So the sense that I have revisiting that passage is that here, rather than the origin being in the past, the origin is in the present. The origination of the idea is in the present, and it's retroactively projected onto not so much the past, but the supra-temporal mind of God that transcends the triadic division of past, present, and future. So I wonder if, number one, if you would endorse that distinction between where does the origin lie? Does it arise here in the present, or is it merely a renewal of what was originated in the past? And whether this may itself be seen as a innovative concept relative to earlier conceptions in the rabbinic and Kabbalistic traditions?
Well, first let me briefly say I liked how you adjudicated the difference between good social vision. So I do embrace that, and so if there is, in that case, it really would be a machloket l'shem shemayim sofo lehitkayim. So thank you for that. Now, with regard to the more substantive comment from the Rashab, I totally agree with you, and that's what I was fumbling really to articulate here. That it's, even though the confluence or compressence of the three tenses in the Shem HaMeforash puts the Ein Sof outside of time, l'mala migeder hazman. Nevertheless, it's a nitzchiyut and an eternality, which is actually the true cadence of time. And so I think it's and the only thing that is real then about time is the moment. The ata, which the Tzemach Tzedek, renders as eight Adonai, right? The eight, the moment, is of the Lord. That is to say, in the moment we can encounter and experience this confluence. So I think I totally embrace your reading that the origin is not in the past. The chidush is not in the past. It is in the present, but we have to understand the present in terms of this confluence of Haya Hove V'Yeh. Right. Now, as to if this is itself a chidush when compared to previous expressions of the paradox of what I call linear circularity, yes, it's a chidush, but a chidush in the sense that we have just understood it.
Right. Okay. Great. Okay, so now I'm going to read out a question from Peter Whitehouse. He says, in your recent paper, Metaphor, Dream, and the Parabolic Bridging of Difference, a Kabbalistic aesthetic, you mention a meditation concerning the Sephardic tree as encapsulating one of the profoundest truths of Jewish esoteric lore. How could our metaphorical and spiritual abstractions of trees connect to our relationship with particular trees, like those that are burning around the world? And how could that contribute to our new social vision and imagined and emergent civilization? Do we need new metaphors or remembered old ones to bridge to a post-secular cosmodernity? Is that right? Cosmodernity? That's the question.
Okay. Well, I'm very impressed that that essay is being referenced. I think it just went up. So I'm I'm impressed.
Even I haven't read it yet.
Yeah. But let me just first contextualize. So what I was talking about there is a very interesting Kabbalistic text that really I think only one other person has discussed, and that's Yossi Chayes. And what's interesting about that text is it doesn't only talk about the Sephardic tree, the tree of luminous emanations, but rather inculcates a practice of, on the part of the reader, of actually drawing or diagramming the Sefirot. So that's what's very interesting about it. So the point I was making there is that the Sefirot collectively are the disclosure of the concealment of the Ein Sof. So that is the paradox, and then something that I've discussed many other places and other people have discussed. Right. So we're talking about a very specific tree there, and that envisioning of the invisible is what I argue is at the core of Kabbalistic idea of metaphoricity or metaphor or mashal. Now, your question extends beyond that, and I'm not sure that I'm equipped to answer exactly, because the issues. I mean, this is a very good question, but one that's very difficult for me to answer. I mean, can we move from what I just articulated to a social program to address the real and burning, no pun intended, burning issues that are before us? That's a very good question. And I think, by the way, that should be a question to what's articulated in social vision as well.
You leaving it at that?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's an impoverished answer that I gave, but it's an honest one. I mean, I think it's very, it becomes very important to see how as it was expressed in the question, we can make use and utilize the old metaphor, or do we need new metaphors? Now, my study of the Rebbe for all these years would suggest to me that it isn't the latter. That's what I was saying, and I sort of articulated it rhetorically at the end by saying that the broken tablets have to be together with the tablets in the Ark of the Covenant. As you can't, it's not a rupture, it's not a complete break. So again, based on the temporal hermeneutic, what is new is going to be something that is old. And precisely because it's old, it can be new. Now, how that works out in terms of the specific question, that's where I don't have a good answer at the moment.
One thing that I might suggest is that I'm just thinking of one example of this kind of where we see the Rebbe taking a Kabbalistic image or metaphor and applying it in the world in a way that previously we might have not done, and previous rabbis had not done, is the idea of the feminine. The idea of the Shekhinah and the feminine. There are explicit places, letters to men, to married men, saying you have to regard your wife as the Shekhinah, right? So he explicated that transference from and that image to apply it in social dynamics, social relations, in a way that I don't think suddenly out of Rav Albert would argue that the Alter Rebbe didn't necessarily see it to be applied in that way yet.
Right.
So that might be a kind of a paradigm, an example.
Right, but you're substantiating what I'm saying. So he's using something that's in the tradition, and there's a kind of elasticity, right? The symbol of the Shekhinah can be reinterpreted or revisioned as it is appropriate in the moment. And I think that, the Rebbe deserves a lot of credit for actually doing that. I mean, did he go far enough for some feminists? Probably not.
Right.
But I take your point.
Okay, we have 5-6 more minutes. I don't see any other questions, so I'll ask quickly one of my own. So another thing that I was thinking about as I absorbed your words, the Rebbe in several places mapped out this notion that in the Messianic future, there are various different eras. There's the era of Yemot HaMashiach and Olam Haba, and then within that itself, he kind of subdivided Olam Haba that's the era when the Leviathan will be eaten, and the era where there will be no eating. And as you put it, these are associated with pleasure and the pleasure of no pleasure. So my question is, do you think that this could also be read as a kind of further affirmation of this idea that even if in some way, as we lose the present and it becomes past and we move to the next moment, and even if we have realized the now as in this messianic way, that the next moment requires a new redemption. And so that beyond the footsteps of the footsteps, there is also the redemption of the redemption.
But what would the redemption of the redemption entail exactly? Getting beyond the need for redemption? Or is that what you're suggesting?
Well, I was thinking, that's the kind of post-messianic messianism that you suggest in your title in Open Secret.
Right.
But what I'm saying is, in some way, is the Rebbe himself saying something like that? What is the Rebbe doing with that? With this investigation of redemption beyond redemption?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think it's for us to keep trying to figure out. But that's what I said. I don't know that he himself squared the circle. In other words, there's a lot that he gave us, and will it all cohere in a kind of consistent or coherent way? I don't know. I'm not certain of that myself.
Right, but I think what we can be certain of is that he would have wanted it to, because that's the vision that he articulated in Yana Shatorat Achsidus, that it's a single whole.
I understand. Yes, that he would have wanted it to, and maybe it is there, and I'm not capable myself of grasping it. But I do think there are disparate dimensions to this. And, in the nature of the Ein Sofiyut of this, right? In the nature of the infinity of the teaching itself, it will constantly engender more pratim, more prate pratim, more details and more details, right? And that in and of itself is an interesting thing to think about in terms of, again, of that moment. That now is infinitesimal, the rega katan, right? It's not so katan, right? It's katnut, it's hitrachvut, it's potential for endless, limitless expansion. It's the point.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I think we'll end on that note, that every moment, every point has endless potential.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Elliot. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much, Elliot and Professor Wolfson, for that deeply insightful and inspiring keynote address and conversation. So this is the last panel of this week of the Social Vision Conference series. We'll be joining again on the same Zoom link next Monday, February 1st at 12 p.m. noon Eastern time for a series of panels that will continue until 4 p.m. featuring talks from Richard Sugarman and Joseph Telushkin and a deliberation on Jewish education. So please join us for that. And with that, we'll close for the week. Thanks so much. Thanks, Ellie. Bye-bye.